public meetings where the public is so confused about why it's happening this way that I suggested to the chairman, why don't we just take a minute and explain why? Because then at least they understand that they're not just being lumps on a law, but they're actually being instructed not to do that, trained not to do that.
And several of you I've talked to about having a statement, a small paragraph, to put right on your agenda and on your sign-in sheet, and to have the chair or the superintendent read at the beginning, because it does seem rude that we're not going to discuss that with you or make you promises or whatever. But if you explain it, I think that the public will start to become accustomed to what public comment looks like at a board meeting.
One other thing about public comment and personnel. I think a simplistic statement of personnel and public comment is that because the person wants to make a comment on an employee of the district, they're shut down. I think that's a good rule of thumb, but I don't think it necessarily always applies. So if the public wants to stand up and complain about the superintendent, sorry superintendents, the public probably has a right to do that because you are the highest ranking official. You're a public official. You likely don't have any privacy interests that the courts are going to recognize. So to shut a person down from complaining about the superintendent is probably not an appropriate thing. Now, if a person wants to stand up and complain about your custodian's work, that's not appropriate to do either, because one, the person isn't there to defend themselves, but two, the board really would have no role in supervising the custodian. That would be something. So that would be another time the board chairman would say, okay, superintendent, please talk to this person. So that's been kind of the rule of thumb, is to avoid personnel matters, because you don't want to breach somebody's privacy. It's never appropriate to stand up and talk about a student in public. Seen that happen, and that board chairman should shut down that discussion quickly to avoid that. On top of page 35, there's the three ground rules that I've used, I think, successfully in a number of controversies. Several years ago, I participated in a whole string of what I call divorces, when the board and the superintendent fall out of love and get divorced. And they are ugly. They're ugly because it's a position of trust that's gone sour. There's generally kids involved, and so it goes ugly. So that year, 3 or 4 years ago, I think I participated in 6 of them. There must have been something in the air because it just was falling apart. Some of them were very public, very ugly, very unruly, and uncontrolled. Like the buildings board divorced its superintendent with everybody in the community watching and everybody screaming. That was ugly. It was painful and ugly. The board chairman at the time called me and said, well, we want to offer an extension on the superintendent's contract. Please prepare it. That's something I do all the time. And that's, superintendent calls and says, so I went to a meeting expecting to present this amendment to extend the superintendent's contract. Well, when I got to the Lincoln Center, where the school district's headquarters is, they were picketing the building. So I was just like, well, that's bizarre. I mean, enough people hate the superintendent. I've only been there, been there for a year. So I had to, I just kind of wandered into the picket line to get around to the front door, and got into this meeting, and it was just packed, and the energy was horrible. Everybody was angry, and so the chairman was like, well, okay, Mr. Weldon, explain the amendment you prepared for the superintendent's contract. It's like, well, I guess I'm proposing that he be hired for another year. I was just like, everybody was upset. So that was kind of the one extreme. The other extreme was, things were not very happy, but I was called up to a meeting. I was able to have more or less private conversations between the superintendent and the chair. When we got to the point where the public, when we were in a meeting and there was a lot of people there because it was controversial, but it was like, okay, really what we need here is just some private time so that we can figure out how this thing's going to unfold. And it's not really fair to the superintendent or the board, frankly, that we have to do this. So I knew that the superintendent had a student in the district. And so I said to the board chairman, and I talked to them before, and I actually mentioned this to the superintendent's lawyer. I said, okay, look, we really just need some space here to talk about this. If the board terminates the superintendent's contract like right now, that person has to leave, which means it does impact the student's educational program. I would like very much for this parent, the superintendent, to explain to the board how this may impact the student's educational program. Pretty clever. So I was able to get the board and the superintendent in a closed room. The superintendent said yes. I mean, I'd have to figure out how. I wouldn't stay here. It's a small town, but I'd have to figure out how to attend to my child who wants to finish high school, yada, yada, yada. So, but we were able to kind of get everybody on common ground and strike a settlement. So that, from the ugly in Billings to the relatively quiet in this district. The other thing I've noticed, and you probably heard this if you've been to these, is that sort of thing happens, and suddenly it's better than reality TV. And so you suddenly now have lots of people in the community coming to your meetings, which is exciting, it's interesting. And I walk into these public meetings, they're generally not in the regular board meeting room because those are small. They'll put them in an auditorium or a rec room, and whoever sets up for the meetings understands there's a bunch of chairs, and they're always set up like weddings. There's a central aisle, and then those who are in favor of the superintendent sit on one side, and those who are against. So if you imagine the usher, it's like, favor the superintendent, against the superintendent, oh, here's your seat here. And so you can always kind of tell when you kind of size up, well, the superintendent still has a little bit of trust or support, but man, look at the people who are hating the superintendent. So those happen. So in those contexts, when we get into the public meeting part, and generally the dynamic is that the board is split. I can predict, if you've got a solid board and a good relationship with the superintendent, and a good relationship with the clerk, you guys have heard this before. If those three relationships are good, then the district is relatively stable. Because the board's working well with the superintendent, the board's working well internally, the board's working well with the clerk, everything seems to be clicking along. If any one of those relationships destabilizes, the board starts getting split against itself, an election happens, and suddenly the old majority is now the new minority, or vice versa, the new, what I mean. Suddenly you have a power shift, and it destabilizes the relationship with the superintendent. I can predict that you will have not only the problems with the relationship in the board and the superintendent and clerk, but other problems will crop up. It just is a dynamic that if I were a sociologist, I'd figure it out on paper, but it seems, I put it this way, sharks smell blood. So if there's problems at the top, then suddenly all sorts of interesting things starts cropping up. Disgruntled employees, the union. The union may see this as an ability to kind of make inroads of power, and it just destabilizes everything. So when I go to those meetings, and I know this is what's going to happen, this is the ground rules that I either have the chairman set out. Sometimes if the chairman is besieged, I'll actually do it myself. So be respectful of the board, be respectful of your employees, and be respectful of public participation. And I found that if you kind of tell the adults, look, you're running a public school system here. What you do is really setting an example for the students. Behave yourselves. Then that really does change the demeanor of the meeting here. It can. Sometimes it hasn't worked that well. So, okay, anything else on public meetings, open meetings? And go back and tell your clerks that if they haven't studied up on the new public information law, send me an email. Did I send you guys the packet that Barry?
No.
Oh, well.
So we'll get that.
Well, it's the same packet that I did at the training here.
Okay.
Do you have that?
Yeah.
I'll send it to you in electronic form so you can send it out.
Okay, that'd be great.
It was effective on October 1st, so it's now no longer. Anything else on open meetings? Okay, let's talk about bullying and student discipline. The Board of Public Ed, 3 or 4 cycles ago, put into place administrative rules and accreditation standards that required your boards to have an anti-bullying policy. And to my knowledge, most boards got caught up with that and have that. And it's a complicated issue because it involves the federal government and anti-discrimination law. But when that rule came out a few years ago, most boards got caught up. You have to have a separate complaint procedure. You have to have notice of how you're going to do how you're going to handle anti-bullying. If your district doesn't have a set of forms and like complaint forms and then forms that your principals can fill out, go to the Billings site, Billings website, and they call it bully-free Billings, or I don't know what they call it, but it's on every page. And just copy those forms. If you don't have them, I can't remember, if you don't have them in electronic form that you can manipulate, let me know and I'll get them for you. And the reason I suggest that is there's no sense in reinventing the wheel on that part of it. And the reason I suggest the Billings one is when this new rule came out, they had a new superintendent in Billings who had worked on the same issue a lot in Washington. And so we contacted Denise Juneau and said, okay, brand new rule. This was not, again, 3 summers ago. Brand new rule. We want to roll it out in the new school year. How about an OPI and the Billings district actually work together to create the materials, the complaint form, the complaint process, blah, blah, blah. And there's like, oh, that's great. So Denise came down to the board, kind of rolled this out, and it's been chugging along. And it's worked pretty well. And the complaint procedure is spelled out, the complaint form. Then there's a form that your principals or superintendent have to fill out if the complaint comes in. And it's worked pretty well.
I'll send it out to all of you, and it even has places where you can insert your own logo, so it's just
Oh, you
very
have it?
user-friendly. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. Don't fuss about having to reinvent the wheel on that for a couple of reasons. And again, not that I'm holding up Billings as like a perfect example of the district. It's not. But what we do have in that case is OPI working with the district to say these forms these work fine, because OPI would have to enforce the accreditation rules that these bullying policies are under. So that's the accreditation rule against bullying, and it's not a bad rule. It defines what bullying is, which you can then say what bullying is not, and it spells it out. Okay. Then the legislature, this last session, decided that they needed to weigh in on bullying, and they passed a new statute that now it's against the law to bully, and parents can sue the school district if their child has been bullied. The problem with the statute is it's late in the week and it's early in the morning and I'm tired. It's sloppy. It doesn't define what the terms are, and worse yet, it doesn't really match the administrative rule that the districts have been living under for the last 2 or 3 years. And so I'm not really happy with the statute, but it's there. But it seems to me that if you follow the administrative rule and all the stuff we've just been talking about relative to what you can get from Stevie, I think you'll be in compliance with the statute as well. Now, the key with that process is you have to let people know that it's out there. So put it on your web pages, put it in your student handbooks, make sure everybody knows. But if you get a complaint where somebody's alleging they've been harassed, bullied, intimidated, make sure you follow it through all the way to the end, including the conclusion of whether or not it's actually bullying. Because that's where we are in our society these days, is that everything and anything is considered bullying. I didn't bring it, but I'll get it to Stevie. There's this great short article about the difference between being rude and being mean and actually bullying. It's okay for administrators to conclude that action taken by a student is not bullying, it's just mean behavior, or it's rude behavior. And it kind of describes what the differences are. It goes to the extent of the conduct, how bad was it, how pervasive, how does it happen more than once, what was the reason for the conduct. So a kid walks by another kid and reaches down and breaks the kid's pencil and walks on. And that's that. Is that bullying? No. It's stupid, rude behavior, but it's not necessarily bullying. Now that same incident could be bullying if it occurs a lot, because the pencil breaker is attempting to intimidate or have some sort of control over that other person. Or the pencil breaking is because that person, the pencil breaker doesn't like the race of the pencil holder. My examples are awkward. Or if the pencil is broken not on the desk, but because the pencil breaker stuck in the other kid's ear and broke it that way. So, the same incident could be bullying, and that's what the administrator actually has to determine. But many, many times, it's not bullying. It's not actionable bullying. It's actually mean or rude behavior. And the conclusion needs to be that. And it needs to be definitive so that that process is wrapped up so that we have the district's determination of whether or not it's bullying. If it is bullying, then you need to take immediate steps to stop it. If you've got bullying or harassment based on gender or any of these other protected classes, you have to take steps to protect the victim immediately. Or worst case scenarios, you'll get calls from the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education, which is a big deal. You don't want those people calling you because they are part of the U.S. Department of Education, and they enforce civil rights, which includes anti-discrimination based on all these things. Now, where we are with bullying and anti-discrimination is, in the 70s, we had discrimination based on girls in sports. And that was what we focused on. Well, our society and the law and everything else has evolved to now really what we're talking about is the rights of transgender children, which is really an interesting discussion, disconcerting to many people, but amazing nonetheless. And so really where we are is as we look at this progression of harassment, intimidation, discrimination, now we have a subset of students, transgender students, whose rights we need to attend to. So that's either progress or not, depending on your views, but that's where we are. And so, so there. Now, Bill, did you ask a question? Who asked the question about bullying? Did you have anything particularly you want to think about, talk about?
Just because we're remodeling policy and at least opening that discussion and talking about that, the majority of our kids are pretty darn good, really are. I think the majority of our community has that philosophy to respect other human beings, and so generally we're okay, but we should have a group, a small group that just, I don't know all the right words, but bullying is one of them. And I think that sooner or later we might be asking the board to expel some of those students. And we don't want to do that, but we're trying all sorts of different stuff.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be working. And they're bullying each other and teachers.
Yeah, it seems to, it gets really complicated fast because, breaking a person's fence on their desk is one thing, but creating a Facebook page over the weekend that's called, West High Whores, and then posting people in that, that's an entirely different. That actually
Question. Bullying by individuals other than students.
Bullying by staff members?
Or even the public on a child, a student.
Well, if the public is bullying a student and it's within your realm, your school day, you can certainly take action to keep that adult against that person. Bullying by staff members can lead to discipline, and policies need to spell out that's prohibited behavior as well. Yes, sir.
You mentioned transgender, and that's a good thing. We have that situation too. But what we're running into, what is the definition of transgender?
I can't pull it out of the top of my head, but there are functional definitions. I will get to Stevie, she'll send to you out Gene Force.
Is there a medical definition?
I don't know if it's medical. I don't know what professional realm it actually comes from, but there are definitions that are commonly accepted: transgender, transsexual. There's a number of them. And astonishingly, if you ask a kid of a different generation than me, like teenagers, they're much more aware, it seems to me, about the nuance of that part of society. Probably because they looked on social media, I suppose. But my daughter has instructed me that I'm so outdated in my attitudes and opinions about things that I just don't get it.
This too shall pass.
Three different.
Yeah.
And I've got Gene's, I think, in electronic form. That was a really good
That'd be
one.
great, yeah. I've got a hard copy, but if you have electronic,
Yeah, Gene Ford is an attorney in Great Falls who presented on that topic here in October, actually in this room. And it was a really good discussion. She had an excellent presentation to explain what's what, but then we had a lot of people attend that meeting, and there was actually a kind of interesting debate among those who attended, and arguing for and against, and I don't know what they were arguing about. Okay, the other thing, Bill, is as you're working on that, contact Marilee, because again, to piggyback on the work that other districts have already done, what we did for the Billings one, and by the way, the Billings district departed from the standard off-the-shelf school board's policies quite a while ago and developed their own. So what Marilee did year ago or so, with like Brenda Koch and all that people in the school district, is they took all of the student discipline policies and updated them and organized them in a way that they talked about the student code of conduct, what is prohibited and acceptable behavior by students, and then another set of policies that talked about if the student violates the student code of conduct. And that clarified a lot of different things, because the old policies are kind of intermixed, and it talks about what prohibited behavior and what expulsion is and that sort of stuff. But email either me or Marilee, and we'll get that one sent to you. Personnel issues.
They don't have any problems with that.
Okay.
Well, Dan might have a question or two for that.
Okay. Your question about personnel.
Well, if you have a teacher that's been there 30 years in this school, how do you approach that? And if the person is on a plan of improvement and really, in that person's mind, is doing a fantastic job, and the student and community side is not, the administrative side is not. How do you encourage that person to use it that way?
Call me your office of fire.
Well,
That's the problem.
Everybody looks at me like,
Yeah.
it is very, very difficult in Montana to terminate the employment of a teacher, and especially if a teacher has tenure rights. Once earned, which just simply means that they've worked in the one place for a series of years, once earned tenure is a constitutionally protected property interest. And it is spelled out in the law as a right and a property interest, and before you, the government, can deny that person that right, that property interest, you have to provide due process of the law, right? You can't deny somebody life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. So that process that we've created in Montana is very, very cumbersome, and it's very difficult to get through to the other side and actually prevail on it. And in Montana, I'm talking about Montana because our tenure laws and our tradition of tenure laws in Montana are unique. Remember a few years ago, there was a California decision, a California court decision that got rid of tenure because they were looking at the student's right versus the tenure teacher's rights. You guys remember that case? And so it was like, oh my God, they got rid of tenure. And then a couple trustees called and say, oh, hooray. And I was like, no. Go look at that case. It all is based on California statutes. Ours are unique and different, so we have to look at that context. So not only is tenure a very settled right in Montana and very well protected, we then have teachers unions in Montana that are very sophisticated, very well funded, very well trained to enforce those rights. So you may well ultimately be able to fire a low-performing teacher, but to get to that point, you're going to have to go through so much work that many times that teacher simply just has to outlast you or outlast the board. And so the fact that that teacher's been there for 30 years, and you haven't been, and the board hasn't been, tells me that, all that teacher really needs to do is outlast you. And that's become, the attitude of some folks is like, all I need to do, the superintendents come and go, board members come and go, all I need to do is outlast them. So if that's the case, and you actually do have a low-performing, poor-performing teacher, then you have to build the case to show that you have sufficient cause to end their employment, which is difficult, because that's something you have to prove over time with relative performance. And you may well only have evaluations for this segment of time, missing for this segment of time, and good evaluations from the past. So what does that record actually end up telling us? It tells us that you've got a problem with this person, the person doesn't have a problem with teaching. Yes.
And on that same line, I don't think board members realize that when you leave, that kind of improvement for that teacher goes out the window. It doesn't necessarily stay in that plan for that teacher's file. So when you're turning over administrators ad nauseum or whatever, it actually doesn't lend itself to getting rid of those teachers. And I don't think a lot of board members realize that.
Yeah,
That's the trouble. I mean, that's the travesty.
that's true, because for performance, you have to build a case that their performance is not adequate, or, in other words, you have to have sufficient cause to terminate somebody because of their poor performance. That's a really difficult thing to do. Misconduct is something different. I mean, if you've got an employee who engaged in misconduct, I mean, the most egregious example I can think of is the Billings teacher who decided, the Billings High School teacher decided he needed to have a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old. That's misconduct, and that's grounds for termination. Done. I mean, those are the easy calls because the behavior was so egregious. Misconduct generally is not that, thank God, it's not that blatant. It's going to be a series of missteps that are going to be very difficult to prove because it's your word against that person's word, or you may not have sufficient documentation, or the misconduct may be so technically abstract it's hard to prove. So, for example, you believe a particular teacher or janitor is using a computer to look at pornography. Well, it's not necessarily, you have to, and nobody's actually has an eyewitness to that actually occurring. You then have to prove the misconduct through a number of different steps and other evidence, right? You have to look at the login information, you have to look at the login time, who had access to the computer, who had access to the room, so on and so on. So again, that's a complicated set of facts to prove that it's misconduct. So poor performance is very difficult to do, particularly if you don't have consistent evaluations through time. Now, is it possible to terminate a teacher in Montana? Yes, it is. And even once you do it, it's not necessarily a done deal, a la Lanier. So in the fall, almost, let's see, 2009, November of 2009, the Lanier board terminated a tenured teacher, and we're now waiting for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to issue a decision. Now that is something that I hope is an extreme case, given the nuance of that person's personality. I also want to say that. But we've been to the Supreme Court 2 or 3 times on that thing. Now, the bizarre backstory of that one is the superintendents with that teacher had presented that teacher for non-renewal for no cause for each of the 3 years that she was a non-tenured teacher, and the board didn't accept that recommendation. Now, if we go back time, the board would probably accept that recommendation. But what the teacher did generally was go around the superintendent of the board and try to convince individual board members it was the superintendent's problem, not mine. And it was successful. And lo and behold, she was offered a 4th-year contract, she was tenured, and by November of that year, the board had to terminate her, and now we're still in a mess. So kind of the tale of woe from Lanier in that particular one is, if the superintendent recommends non-renewal for no cause of a teacher, right, be comfortable with the fact that there's a reason. There's always a reason. And if you have the right to non-renew somebody's employment for no cause, and you may be dodging a bullet with that employee, so take that opportunity. And I know it's difficult if you've got a problem with the way the superintendent operates, or that teachers' relatives are sure-tell relatives of yours, or you go to church with that. I know that, but just understand that teachers have essentially a 3-year probationary period for your administrators to evaluate whether or not they're a good teacher or should be in your district. And if they conclude that they shouldn't be, then I think it's a good telltale sign that you should take that recommendation. Right? Not everyone's going to end up like the story they're telling about out of Lanier, but that really was an example of the board had an opportunity to not renew the person, didn't, for whatever reason, and still all in all mess. Yes.
I guess you talked about superintendent's recommendation.
Yes.
And that's really what it should, I mean, just because you might have a really good teacher, but just because you've been headshot in the past, I guess our board really has to be careful. You don't want to just non-renew all your 3-year teachers just because you don't want them to be tenured, to make sure that it's valid, that you take the recommendations, that you might have a really good teacher, and if you lose them, then you're gonna, who knows what you're gonna get next.
Yeah, that's true. So you're talking about a situation where the superintendent may recommend renewal, but the board rejects the recommendation because they feel like the teacher's not good or they're fearful of tenure or something like that. Yeah, the good rule of thumb to follow is that you hire officer to operate the school. They're called the superintendent. And they hire lieutenants to operate buildings. They're called principals. They're educators, and they work in the district every day. And if they have a recommendation, a professional recommendation concerning employment, you really should take it. Now, that doesn't mean that the trustees just sit there in their hands and don't get involved in the process, because it's entirely appropriate to ask questions about that teacher's evaluation. So say you've got a recommendation to non-renew a non-tenured teacher in front of you. You can say to the superintendent, superintendent, did the district follow the evaluation procedures for teachers? Yes. Okay. Did the board, or did the district follow the other rights of this teacher in the collective bargaining agreement? Yes. Those are good questions, legitimate questions, because you're asking about whether or not the district's at risk by not bringing this person back. But understand those two things. You hire professional educators to run your district, and two, there is always a reason for the non-renewal of a non-tenured teacher. Even though the superintendent doesn't have to prove it to you and you don't have to find it, there is a reason. It's just that we do this weird kind of legal dance to say we don't have to prove cause to non-renew a non-tenured teacher. But there's always a reason. And the evaluation process and communication with the teacher should have occurred, so by the time it comes to the board, it's not going to be a surprise to the teacher. And also, I always suggest in the spring of the year, if these things are coming down, give the board a heads up, do a little mini in-service on how this works in case the board hasn't had to deal with it for a while. Because it can be a train wreck. I had witnessed a train wreck, participated in one, it was in the buildings district, and the principals brought the superintendent 2 names of non-tenured teachers to non-renew. And so I went to the board chair and I said, well, board chair, has the board gone through this no-cause non-renewal process? And she said, yes, we do it frequently. Well, now I realize what she meant was that they pink slipped their non-tenured teachers, meaning because of budget reasons, they need to lay off all their non-tenured teachers, then hire back as many as they can. Well, that's not really no-cause non-renewal. That's actually the cause of non-renewal for budget reasons. But I didn't communicate well enough with the chair to say, okay, well, this is the process. So we get to the board, the superintendent stands up and says, I recommend the non-renewal of these 2 teachers for no cause. And the board just looked at him like, what is that? And one trustee actually said, it's un-American not to tell the person why they're being fired. Well, wait, that's not what's happening. And of course, then what happened, the teacher stood there at the lectern and had all of her students lined up behind her, and 2/3 of them were crying because she was the best teacher in the world. And believe me, there were good reasons. This person was not being renewed, and they've gone through evaluation and plan of improvement, yada, yada, yada. But the board's now confused because they don't really understand the concept of no cause non-renewal. It's weird. It is counterintuitive. And I had the teacher and all these kids saying she's the greatest thing in the world. It was a train wreck. Was there? Yeah. Yeah, there. And yeah, I've always said, if I ever represent a student in an expulsion matter, I won't, because I work for school districts, but if I ever do, I would do 3 things. 1, make sure the kid shows up and the parents show up, because a lot of times I've been to expulsion hearings where neither show up, and that's what breaks your heart. But make sure the kid shows up, clean the kid up a little bit, make them comb their hair, make sure their hoodie isn't over their head, and then somebody needs to cry. Somebody needs to cry. Yeah, and if somebody cries, oh man, my kid's not going to be expelled. Because your board are parents and grandparents and community members, and oh my God, we're going to lose this child forever. And yeah, it's really good if it's an old person who cries, because then it really, or the kid. That's really, if the kid cries, if the kid apologizes and cries. You probably if you've been to these things, I've told this story about this expulsion. So this is what not to do if you have your kid in front of the board for expulsion. So, school districts here in Yellowstone County had a whole rash of drug sales. And in fact, it looked like there was a whole kind of coordinated ring of sales in schools. So there was about 4 or 5 kids in front of the board for expulsion, because they'd had it, and the superintendent had had it, and said, okay, we've got to send a message, you peddle drugs, buy drugs on campus, you are out of here. So they brought 4 or 5 kids in front of the board, one right after another this particular night. Well, this one kid was kind of the linchpin of the whole thing. I think he was the one that was going out and getting the drugs and then bringing it back and distributing it. And so he showed up, and sure as heck, he was set there. First, he had his hoodie over his head, and all dressed in black. He had black fingernail polish on. Kind of the shaggy looking kid, kind of sitting there like he's pathetic. And his mom, sitting next to him, was equally pathetic. And it's like, oh, I wonder where he's getting his drugs. So the board was really struggling with what to do, right? And the kid didn't have bad grades. And, otherwise it really wasn't a discipline problem, but it was very obvious from the other kids where the drugs were coming from. So the board was really trying to figure this out. And I know the board was thinking about, well, let's expel him for the rest of the year. Let's then come back and meet with him at the end of the summer, and we'll see. Because they'd done that with 2 or 3 other students. And it was great to see the difference in the students who came in. One kid came in with his dad, and the kid's hair was shaved. He was bald. And he was enrolled in the private home basic training camp of the dad who was off. And that kid was not going to, he was there, and he was there, and he was at attention. And the dad's like, he says, I don't want the kid in school right now. This is what our regimen is. So apparently the kid had long hair, and that was important to him. He knew when they had hair. And then a variety of other things. So this mom was sitting next to this kid, and she was this kind of skinny, shaky kind of weight of a person. The board was like, well, what do we really do? And I knew the mom really wasn't tracking. They talked about how difficult it is for this kid because, when McDonald's closed and they have to go to their car to sleep at night because they don't always live with the dad. And it was like, oh my God. So the board's so at one point, one of the trustees said, well, with expulsion to the end of the semester, and all the mom heard was expulsion. And she stood up and she said, F word, you F-worders. You've got worse drug dealers in your school than this kid. It's like, shut up. You just told the board that your kid was a drug dealer. Shut up. And she stormed it through some of the paper, and she F-worded a few more times, and this kind of stormed off. And I was just like, somebody else could have gotten hold of that kid when he was 2 or 3 years old. So, anyway, yeah, you have a kid in front of the board, clean him up, make sure he shows up, and then bring in somebody to cry. That's a great tactic. So. Well, that's student discipline. That's what we're talking about. Expulsions. It's almost 10. I think you told me.
10, 15, whenever you're done.
Well, they may be done.
They don't get done.
I'm going back to the jurisdiction question. For those of us that propose rules on that. Montana law says that people can't come in and blame the teacher. $500 fine. How do we enforce it?
Well,
Because it seems to me we have a liability
yes.
to enforce it if we have somebody doing that.
Yes.
So how do we do it?
That's the hammer that allows you to really enforce control over your school, because you've got an obligation to educate your kids and to keep this environment safe for your employees. The hammer you have is that statute that says if you do this, then it can be a crime. You'd have to go to the criminal enforcement agencies to do that. So your question is, how do you enforce that in a school in Indian country? Well, the school is actually a subdivision of the state of Montana. It's an independent agency, but under not a lot of different analyses, it's a subdivision of the state of Montana. So it's a Montana entity, and the ground, generally speaking, is owned by the school district, not leased from it. So the county sheriff has jurisdiction to enforce state law on your ground, on your campus. If the perpetrator is Native American, then the sheriff has to call the BIA police or the tribal police and transfer that person to that criminal justice system so they can prosecute over there. And it may be a different crime if they're going to prosecute over there, maybe disturbance of the peace or something like that. So just like everything else in Indian country, criminal jurisdiction is very confusing and confused, but it takes really good coordination between the county sheriff's office and the tribal police and the police, and then making sure that it actually goes to the right, either to, could be enforced in tribal court, like a misdemeanor disturbance of the peace sort of thing, or if it's really serious, it would go in the federal court system for felony prosecution. But I don't think you would see a Native American who committed a crime on school, even though it's state ground, so to speak, being prosecuted in state court, because it's within the exterior boundaries of the reservation. Now, happily, we don't enforce laws in schools. We turn them over to law enforcement to figure that out. But your code of conduct, employee conduct, code of conduct, student code of conduct, and public code of conduct can be enforced by you. And so the superintendent has the authority to say to somebody, you are no longer welcome to come into our schools because you're disrupting the educational environment of our students. And therefore, you may not trespass into our buildings. Easier said than done a lot of times, but that's the authority the superintendent has. That's my story, I'm sticking to it.
But you can also, this is what I've done in my school district. If I know that a person has an issue with an employee, I have them check into the office, and then either me or the principal will escort them.
Oh, that's good.
Or have them come to our office and have a conversation with that person. That seems to help also. So that, because I think that we want to encourage the parents to come in and have conversations with, your employees, but you also want to control that so it doesn't get out of control.
Are you talking about somebody who's not a parent of the student, or we're talking about a parent of a student?
Nobody in.
Oh, nobody in particular. Yeah, if it's a parent, I think Nancy's advice is good, which is, generally we tell parents to start in the chain of command where it's most appropriate. So you're upset with a parent or teacher, you go talk to the teacher, then the principal and the superintendent, you have that hierarchy. But if there's some sort of conflict, or it's been conflict in the past, you have the superintendent and the principal to run interference, and others if you have to. And it may be really complicated because it gets special ed, so you have to bring in, the IEP team to kind of referee the conflict. But I think the criminal jurisdiction part is just like criminal jurisdiction otherwise. It depends on where the crime occurred, and it depends on who committed the crime. And that's all I'm going to remember from the class I took in law school.
Who's the victim?
And who the victim is. That's right. I'm sorry. That's the third thing.
This is another subject, but, so what is our obligation nowadays with all the active shooters and all that kind of stuff going on? And what is our obligation? I mean, it takes a lot of money to make that school where it's all locked, and you have to or whatever. And we don't have that situation. What's our liability on that if someone comes in?
Well,
Which they could anyway, when it's locked down, but.
that's true. But what we're looking at is, again, just parsing out kind of the technical analysis of it. We're talking about negligence law. So what is your obligation to your students and employees? Your duty, because keep in mind, for you to have to pay money because you've done something wrong, you have to prove that there was some sort of duty that you had, and that you didn't follow that duty, breached the duty, and that caused somebody damages. Now, there may be criminal prosecution if you were criminally negligent. That's another part of it. But just looking at somebody who's injured or killed on your campus under your watch, what would the courts look at? First of all, if something horrible like that happens, expect a lawsuit. I mean, there's people who will sue and I haven't heard about it, tracked it, the theater in Colorado, no doubt, had been sued for negligence in their security. The county in San Bernardino will almost certainly be sued because that's just the nature of our system, I guess. So what we look at is what duty do you owe your students and your staff? And it's a very high duty. It's a very significant duty of care. So you have an obligation to keep your students safe while they're within your power. And that's true of employees as well. So if there are things that you do and should have done or could have done to prevent that harm, you may be judged harshly. You may say, well, you had a high duty, but you didn't meet your duty. You breached your duty by not having adequate security. Now, what is adequate security? So in other words, you fight about what is the actual duty. I mean, the school, the Sandy Hook Elementary School was locked down. I mean, they had, it sounds like a fairly sophisticated, now, it was not a jail, it was not a fortification. I think what happened is the shooter literally shot himself through the glass windows of the front door. But everything, there was a lockdown. They had the routine lockdown. And adults went to address the situation immediately and when the first killed. So, you know, I mean, it's nearly possible. But I think the schools are taking it seriously. I think there was I remember it was on TV or in the newspaper, there was some discussion about some new security efforts that Hellgate Elementary in Missoula was taking up, and it's kind of a different state-of-the-art thing. A lot of other schools have done a lot of training. I was talking with, I think it was the superintendent, Big Sandy, who works with the local sheriff's office to do shooter drills. And he was telling the story. I was like, oh my God, I hope everybody's adequately warned when something like that happened. I wonder if I dropped dead of a heart attack, because they come in with blanks, but it's loud. He says, you know, having somebody come into a building and shoot blanks, and the students and the teachers and everybody are there when this is occurring. He says it's a very different sort of environment than just having some sort of fire, because you actually hear the rounds. And the superintendent was saying, he says, you know, he knows it's really coordinated. He says it still is completely unnerving. You lose your mind. So they go through very intensive drills that way, and then figure out if local law enforcement must fail and didn't fail. So in other words, they're trying to meet their duty to find a way to keep those schools safe in that particular environment. But I think at a minimum, you need to have some physical security elements, like the ability to lock the door during the course of the day. And I think if you don't lock your door these days during the school day while students are in the building, you're not even meeting minimum level of security, it seems to me. Adding remote access. Many schools now have a camera where you have to buzz in. And I had an interesting question the other day. So a school has one of these cameras, and then somebody on the inside buzzes, and then with the buzz you can open the door. And the person that went to the superintendent and complained that they were deaf, and so they didn't hear the person say, "Come in," the door. But we found out that in fact the system has a red and green light. So as long as that person knows there's a light, they can watch. So what is your duty? I think in this day and age, it's very, very high, and it is a very expensive proposition to do. And when the legislature just recently passed, what was that? Help me out if any of you can remember. There's a way that you can transfer funds to have an emergency plan or a safety plan.
Yeah, you can transfer funds from your bus depreciation, from your fund to all the.
For safety plan, because it used to be like just to create a plan, but I think some schools now are doing that to buy, you know, not bulletproof, but secured glass for front doors and cameras and stuff like that. I think the legislature they didn't fund anything, but they allowed you the flexibility to do that. So one more thing to worry about, and worry a lot about, because I don't know, it just seems like it's so common. Horrifying.
It is horrifying, and this question came up in one of our board trainings. And I said, rule of thumb, think about every child in that building under your supervision and control has your last name. So what would you do? Everything you can. And bottom line is everything.
Yeah, and you know, it's the difference between hiring additional teachers versus hiring a secure front door. I mean, that's why people are elected to the board of trustees, because they like to make such important decisions. I think if you don't start working towards a more secure facility, and something does happen, you could be held liable. That's probably our reality.
So until you can afford that, the best rationale is to lock the door, have somebody there to open it at every.
I think at a minimum, yeah. I mean, does anybody disagree that at a base minimum, you should have your school doors locked? So outside people can't come in without something to I don't know. You know, you're right. I mean, the person who's intent on coming in with a gun and doing harm, they're going to shoot their way in regardless, but, you know, at a minimum. So, anyway. Any other questions before I have to go to Miles City, so I asked if he switched around.
Jeff is traveling to Eastern Montana today. We all, I'm sorry, we're not going with you.
Hey, according to people who live west of us, we live in Eastern Montana. I had a friend from Thompson Falls who visited Lewistown and said, man, you know, Eastern Montana's not so bad.
So we don't teach geography anymore in school, you know.
And I love the people who say, well, you know, you live in Eastern Montana, you live in Billings. It's like, oh, well, head east, see what you find. For a lot.
Well, we appreciate your flexibility in getting to us today before you have to take off. That's great. And so we're going to be on break. I want you to take your full 15 minutes for a break. And then when you come back, I want you to organize by school. So sit with your colleagues. We'll get started in 15 minutes.